it would leave room for other countries to tap into these markets and be able to sell their goods more. And we can see this by the fact that China has accumulated such extensive reserves that there's no economic justification for the level of reserves that it has. And it's continuing, acquisition of these reserves. And quite frankly, I think that except for a very few scholars, most people agree that this is in fact true. China, on the other hand, said, look, I'm sorry, but we're a poor country. We have a lot of people that we need to employ. We're just now beginning to emerge out of poverty in many instances. This is the only way that we can sustain the kind of economic growth that we need to pull up standards of living. And they've also said that if we began to do what you suggested, that there would be social unrest in China that could be really devastating for political and social order. So they said, we're going to move in that direction, but we're going to do so slowly, and you cannot push us to do this too quickly. China, on the other hand, said, well, the US, you're really doing something wrong too. You have an overly expansionary set of fiscal and monetary policies, and you are taking your medicine. You need to deflate your economy. You need to save more. You need to bring your budget deficit into balance. Otherwise, you're going to create problems. And the US is saying, look, we just went through a horrible crisis, and unless we follow these policies, our population is going to be unemployed, and we're going to have very slow growth. And a lot of this came into even sharper focus when the United States announced in the fall its policy of quantitative easing 2, or QE2. You may have heard of that. Okay? So quantitative easing occurs when the central bank buys things like treasury bonds from other economic actors and puts them on its balance sheet. What this does is issue more credit and liquidity into the financial system. So when the US announced this, it only exacerbated these problems, right? Again, China and the rest of the world is saying, US, you have to deflate. And here the United States is, if anything, augmenting its policy of following a very expansionary course. And now other countries really began to operate. Right? The RMB, in effect, is pegged to the dollar. As the US began to follow this policy of quantitative easing too, the dollar began to go down in value with respect to other currencies. Because the Chinese currency is linked to the US currency, this meant that the value of the Chinese currency is beginning to go down as well. So countries like Thailand, Korea, Japan, especially countries in Asia, began to feel a lot of pressure, right? Now China's products are even cheaper than theirs, becoming cheaper all the time. So countries that, like Japan, are just trying to get out of the crisis themselves suddenly find they can't compete with China at all, and their competitive position is declining. So this has created a tremendous, tremendous set of problems. And the other part of this is that as a result of this, because the dollar is going down in value, currencies in much of the emerging markets began to appreciate. Because interest rates were low in the United States and people were looking for good investments, they began to look at countries like Brazil, right? Malaysia, Peru, Korea, all these countries, and say, wow, that's a pretty good place to put my money. So remember this dynamic of countries beginning to see these inflows, their reserves going up. Look at the types of inflows that are now going into emerging markets, and look at the growth of reserves in many of the countries around the world. So countries like Brazil, Peru, Korea, all these countries began to see a whole new set of problems that emerged because of this set of policies in the United States. So specifically, these huge flows into emerging markets were caused by a number of factors. One, we still have low interest rates in the US. So people who are looking for higher yields on their investment began to look around the world and began to invest in emerging markets. Currencies, as we said, were appreciating in value. So this made it seem like a safe bet. So if you put money into Brazil and you know the Brazilian currency is strengthening, it only adds to your returns. These countries were predicted to have faster economic growth than most of the developed markets. So it was seen as a good place to put your money because companies there would be growing and growing and their profits would be growing, their earnings would be going up. And there was a general perception that finally emerging markets were putting in place better policies. So they had undertaken structural reforms, they were following better economic policies, certainly much better than had been in place 20 or 30 years ago. So all of this had a set of very dramatic impacts. First, you see this appreciation, but it built on itself. The more capital flowed into these countries, the more their currencies began to appreciate. As their currencies appreciated, you begin to see countries really losing their ability to export. Right? So Brazil, Chile, all these countries began to say, our economies are going to be in trouble. We can't export anymore. Countries like China are really beginning to take over our markets. Another problem is that these kinds of inflows often lead to credit booms. Credit booms can create financial instability, as we talked about in the case of the United States, especially if they lead to big increases in things like the prices of housing and equities and other types of investments. In fact, the single best indicator that a financial crisis is coming is when you have a credit boom of the sort that we saw in the United States, that we saw in many of the Asian countries in the 97-98 crisis, that we saw in Mexico in 1995, etc. So a lot of countries suddenly were beginning to face worries about the solvency of their financial system. And then finally, these sorts of flows of capital are also prone to what we call sudden stops. So the money's coming in, and then all of a sudden it stops coming in. And that can be very, very dangerous for countries, especially emerging market countries, that don't have a lot of financial depth and that have generally a lot of volatility. Okay, so this led to a number of policy dilemmas. Okay. The first is, it became very apparent, countries pressured the United States, please change your policies, please don't do quantitative easing. And guess what the US said? Sorry, this is important to us. Our currency is the world currency. Even if we follow these set of policies, you're going to continue to accept dollars. Too bad. Right? This may remind you, those of you who know economic history may remember the Bretton Woods system. Sure. In the late 1960s, European countries were saying, please, please, please stop doing what you're doing. You're going to destroy Bretton Woods. And Nixon's top economic advisor had a wonderful statement. He said, it's our currency, but it's your problem. Basically he said, too bad. We're a big country, we can push you around. We don't really care if this hurts you, this is what we need to do for ourselves. So once the US has adopted this policy, it's very, very hard to push it to do anything differently. So most countries were caught in a crossfire, right? And they were really faced with three different options. Now we're talking about emerging markets. The first was, okay, we saw that their currencies are appreciating, so just accept it. We're not going to be able to export as much. Maybe we should develop our domestic markets, or we just have to tolerate lower growth. Right? So this is what the US and other countries would like China to do. Right? They would like to see the Chinese currency appreciate. They'd like to see China rely less on exports.